title. My name is Milan Nič. I'm the head of the Robert Bosch Center for Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia at the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. It is my honor and pleasure to be chairing today's discussion. We have a terrific panel that I will introduce in a moment. This session will explore current trajectory of Russia's foreign policy and EU-Russia relations, not only as both Moscow and Berlin gear up for parliamentary elections later this year, but also shortly after Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was arrested upon his return from Germany to Moscow. We will also discuss how Russia's experience with coronavirus pandemics might have fostered the Kremlin's wait-and-see attitude towards both foreign policy and relations with Europe, as well as how the new administration of US President Joe Biden will deal with Russia and change perhaps this outlook. There was already a first phone call between Presidents Biden and Putin earlier this week, and an important agreement on the New START treaty extension, which is an encouraging moment for Europe and for global security architecture. Also, High Representative for European Foreign Policy, Josep Borrell, will travel to Moscow next week for talks with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov ahead of European Council in March, in which EU leaders will look at the EU-Russia framework long-term. So with this, let me also mention that in our event, we are formally presenting the Strategy Group Russia Final Report, which was sent to you by email earlier today. You can also find it at our webpage at the dgap.org. The final report is composed of updated position papers from previous strategy group sessions during last year. They were focused on EU-Russia relations, Russia-China, Russia-US relations, always with the Russian speaker or expert. And there is a concluding chapter. The whole volume was edited by my colleague Andras Radz, who is one of the speakers today. I'm delighted also to see some of the authors of input papers in this volume with us. Our strategy group on Russia 2020 was chaired by Manuel Sarrazin, member of German Bundestag's Foreign Relations Committee and the spokesperson for Eastern European policy of the Greens parliamentary group. Manuel will also kick off our discussion with the opening remarks in a minute. Afterwards, we will have a panel discussion, and our distinguished speakers are Andras Radz, Senior Fellow at the DGAP. Hello, Andras. Then Liana Fix, Program Director for International Affairs at Körber Stiftung. Hello, Liana. Liana has a new book on German power in EU-Russia relations coming in May, and an excellent article at our sister publication, International Politik Quarterly, on the end of Merkel-Putin couple and how the Kremlin will be tempted to test the mettle of Angela Merkel's successor after September's federal elections in Germany. And last but not least, our third speaker is Mikhail Tuman, foreign policy correspondent of the Zeit Weekly. Mikhail also has an article at the new edition of International Politik Quarterly on Putin, Erdogan, and the national international after the departure of Donald Trump as American president. And he also published a new book on a similar topic. So panel discussion will be then followed by question and answers. You will be able to pose a question or share a comment through a raised hand function. But first, Manuel, the floor is yours for introductory remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Milan, for this introduction. I don't want to make too long remarks, but I think some words and some thoughts perhaps on the events from the weekend with the significant protest which came up all over Russia. I think the most of us see this as fascinating development, having such a broad momentum in the country. And also, if you look to the people joining in, I think this could be perhaps a starting point for a development which over mid to long term can show change in the political culture among the population in Russia, kind of self-empowerment of not being quiet anymore and of speaking out. And especially that you see somewhere in Siberia protests gathering together with at least some Belarus not official or former official state flags is an interesting momentum, which I think nobody could see like that before. And it is showing that something in Russia is changing. We have been following in the strategy group a lot of changes in the society, developments there. And I think that this protest, this kind of protest, this broadness of protest is a signal that indeed there is something changing. We don't know how this will develop. This can have different outcomes. I think the state's lust will do everything to suppress it. They know how dangerous it is, especially in front of the Duma elections. And we can be not really certain about how the protests will be able to survive, or perhaps how the Vlast will have problems to extinguish them. But I think one thing is clear. Regarding Russian foreign policy, this protest will not be seen as a main foreign policy part. I think some people in Russia, perhaps even a relevant group also going to the streets, might disagree with Putin's strategy of confronting the West and playing a kind of island endangered by the West. But we cannot expect that the Russian government will change its foreign policy because of this protest. It might be, even if there is a effect of this protest on Russian foreign policy, this would be probably not lead into a softening of this. Perhaps even more to try to organize new foreign political prestige at home to attract people outside the big capitals with this momentum of Velikaya Rossiya. So I think we should look at this protest, not overcrowding this with foreign policy ideas, strategies, or trying to hook them up as so-called Western New Hope. I think this is the special point of this protest, where they are clearly Russian protests, and we should look at them. We should have solidarity, but we should also leave them to be Russian. And this is my starting point, perhaps, and this might give us perhaps also some ideas for the speakers, which I'm really happy and lucky to be able to listen to.
Thank you, Manuel. Over to our panel. We will start with Andras Rats, who is the editor of this brand new publication on Russian foreign policy. And in its title, it says something which is not an easy word even to pronounce: multi-vectorialization. There are various concepts on Russian foreign policy, various waves of engagement, disengagement, undermining each other between Russia and the West, Russia and Europe. But multi-vectorialization is something that I was pondering when Andras came with it. And I would invite him to explain what does it mean?
Thank you, Milan, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. And I apologize for the complicated title. If that helps in any way, it's complicated also for me to pronounce. When it comes to the history of the expression, the term multi-vectorialism, it has been first used by former Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma. And Kuchma called multi-vectorialization as a kind of a title word or a keyword for a foreign policy based on balancing, based on trying to establish good relations with all of Ukraine's partners. However, when we use the term multi-vectorialization in connection with Russia, the story is now different. So what we plan to describe in this report about Russian foreign policy by using this complicated word multi-vectorialization is basically that while there have been periods of contemporary Russian foreign policy when Russia has been striving for having good relations with the West, this is not the case anymore. This is not the case anymore, and this is a lasting phenomenon. We see on Russian foreign policy a lasting tendency of turning away from the West. So good relations with the EU, good relations with the other side of the Atlantic is not a priority anymore. So no reset is in the pipeline. Good relations is not a priority, at least, or any kind of changes is possible only if it takes place on Russia's own terms. And we all know that this is not going to happen. And this turning away from the West, this strategic turning away from the West, has been fueled by the number of additional factors that took place during last year, so in 2020. One of these factors have been, of course, the Navalny case, which, I mean, the intensity of German reactions and also EU reactions apparently surprised the Russian elites a bit, how sharply Europe reacted to the Navalny story. Another factor contributing to Russia's lasting turning away from the West is, of course, the outcome of the presidential elections in the United States. And what this turning away means in the practical terms, well, turning away where? China. So in the report, you find 2 chapters dealing with Russia-China relations, one written by Natalia Chabarovskaya and the other one written by Niklas Svanström, and both authors, independently from each other, that's interesting, both authors argue that Russia-China relations, albeit it's not an alliance, but it's kind of a marriage of convenience based on shared interests, based on interests which might be shared for a long time. So even though this is not an established and institutionalized alliance, it's going to develop toward the direction of a lasting strategic partnership along shared interests. And this is also a phenomenon that we consider something that is going to stay with us in the years to come. So if this is good for an introduction, then thank you, Milan, and floor is back to you.
Very good, Andras. Let me add that we were lucky to have as a co-author on this Russia-China chapter from Russian side, a very good expert who used to be think tanker, then joined the Russian business, private sector, but was not allowed to use a real name. So this is we had to be creative and come up with this solution, but read the text is very good. And this is a tendency that throughout the year we have detected with our Russian colleagues and partners. There is a increasing pressure in their relations, even with German Council of Foreign Relations. On Russian side, the stakes are, the government is raising the stakes basically. I know that I see Ambassador Markus Ederer with us, the head of EU delegation. I know they have another project on EU-Russia relations. I don't know whether how they are coping with this pressure on Russian authors, but this is with us to stay. Without further ado, over to our second speaker, Liana Fix. Liana, you have a forthcoming book on Russia-EU relations and the role of Germany in that. When you look at the current trajectory of Russian foreign policy, or you had a chance to read our report, what comes up as the most interesting to you?
Thanks so much, Milan. Thank you, Andras, for the invitation, also for the paper, which I really had the time to read completely and in detail, which I'm very happy about, because I thought those were really excellent contributions and very insightful to understand the trajectory of Russian foreign policy. I will try to make 3 points on EU-Russia relations, but also on what you just mentioned, Andras, where Russian foreign policy is headed. The first point is that I agree with the papers on EU-Russia relations in the compilation, which basically say that there's no reason to be optimistic in EU-Russia relations, right? I mean, both papers are very pessimistic, the 2 papers, and they argue that EU-Russia policy has basically turned into sanctions policy in recent years. That is something I would agree with, and that is also, to come back to what you just said at your introduction, Milan, the visit of Joseph Borrell to Moscow, which will make this visit extremely difficult, because the question is, what kind of leverage does he have when he travels to Moscow, especially since the European Union has decided to postpone the sanctions issue on Navalny. And also because domestic issues are usually, and the case of Navalny is such a high-level domestic issues, are usually not issues where Russia, where you can negotiate with Russia, right? I mean, in domestic issues, they very clearly pursue their own policy, independent of whether there are threats of sanctions or anything. So it would be very, I think it is bad timing. It would look bad if Borrell returns from Russia with empty hands and if shortly after Navalny gets convicted. So I'm not entirely sure why the idea is that this timing can really, that he's able to exert some leverage on domestic events in Russia. And this relates to one point that you and Andras formulated in your paper. You argued in relations between EU and Russia, cross-topic concessions is something that we should definitely avoid in the relationship. And while this is something that I wholeheartedly agree with, I was wondering whether this also means that in our relationship, we have to exclude cross-topic leverage, right? Because that's sort of the other side of the coin. If you say we don't do cross-topic concessions, can we do cross-topic leverage? And I was wondering whether this really is a tool that we should exclude from our toolbox. And when I mean cross-topic leverage, this, you know, one can be very creative about this, but obviously Nord Stream 2 comes up as an idea, right? How can you exert cross-topic leverage from Nord Stream 2, protests in Belarus, Navalny, right? I mean, there could be some links made in negotiations, but then one probably would also have to accept that cross-topic leverage could be a useful tool, but might also lead to a situation where you would have to accept cross-topic concessions in some points. And I'd be interested to hear what you think on this.
We can go deeper into this in Q&A session.
So, yeah.
But let me invite Mikhail Tuman, who has.
Just very shortly, one third point, just very quickly on the multi-vectorial foreign policy.
Go ahead, Lena.
Yeah, just to complete my 3 points, if I already announced them at the beginning. My third point on the multi-vectorial foreign policy, it's exactly what you said, Andras. I was wondering for how long this idea of a multi-vectorial foreign policy holds, or whether it would perhaps not be clearer to say immediately it is a movement of turning away from the West, from Europe, and turning away to and turning east to China. So is this really still multi-vectorial? And for me, immediately Kazakhstan comes up, which had a different multi-vectorial foreign policy in terms of hedging against Russia. But wouldn't it even be sort of clearer to say it is turning away from Europe and turning towards China? Because I think that's also the tension in the 2 contributions on China, which to some extent disagree on the component of ideology, how important ideology is in driving the 2 countries together. And I think I stumbled upon a quote from Peskov, who said that China will not be able to replace Russia's multi-vector cooperation and partners. And I wonder whether this is sort of the crucial question we have to deal with, whether in 5 years it is really multi-vectorial, or whether we will have a much clearer Russia-China alignment, and whether what Andrei Kortunov's write in the publication, the US will be able to continue the dual containment policy towards China and Moscow. I think that's perhaps a good point for Mikhail to come in. Sorry.
Thank you, Liana, also for this additional point. And had we had more time for more sessions last year, the whole design was delivered, of course, was planned at the beginning of 2020, even before the pandemic. The other vector we would have explored would be Turkey, of course. And I cannot think of somebody more experienced and seasoned sort of observer of Russia and Russian foreign policy and Turkey than Mikhail Tuman, our third speaker. Although we haven't agreed that you would also comment Turkey, I would invite you to do so.
Yes, thank you very much, Milan. I'll try to bring Turkey into what I was going to say. Let me start actually with one sentence which has caught my attention in the book, which I found very intriguing among all the other brilliant analyses which I've read, and most of which I can agree with. So this sentence was Putin's constitutional changes underscored the primacy of Russia's domestic agenda and the principle of national self-reliance over foreign policy. So I think this is very important to understand Putin's view and to understand how many members of the Russian elite see Russia today, or what they dream Russia to be. This national self-reliance. It's an entirely old idea, I would argue. I mean, we had already concepts like Surkov's Suverenная Demokratia. We also had 19th century concepts by Berdyaev and Uvarov and all pondering this idea of national self-reliance. How I would label this, what they have in mind today and what Putin has in mind, let me give it a name which I would call Planet Putin. And Planet Putin is a country which does not depend on the outside world, basically not on multinational structures, on any other country. It's an economically modest country, but close to autarky, militarily invincible and politically closed, and a country which tries to have its own digital sphere. They are working on it, although I think recent events have shown that this is impossible, but anyway, this is the dream. And of course, being energy independent. So it's basically a conception of self-sufficiency across the board. A planet out there with no need of the rest of the universe. So the question is, can this plan work? And here I would like to briefly touch on the new administration in Washington and what kind of, what the attitude of Putin is. I think it's obvious that in the past, with the past administration, Putin benefited a lot, and that he was able to move and to fill in the gaps the US was leaving behind in the world, especially in the Middle East, but also elsewhere. And Putin also made his sympathies clear after the US elections. So he reacted very cruelly to this administration. And of course, when he saw the list of candidates, the new heads of ministries and departments in Washington, you say, oh, I know all of them. You know, it's a very familiar team and it's clearly a horror cabinet to Putin. So, but there is, I think, in the reasoning of the Kremlin, there is a prospect that Biden and his wonderfully French-speaking liberal diplomats will be out in 4 years' time because there are lots of problems. And actually here I coincide, if I do not coincide with Putin in other ways very often, but here my proposition, what can happen, and Putin's hopes might coincide in a dark way, that these nationalists are there to stay. I think that, and here comes Turkey, and Turkey has kind of the same outlook. They try to now, let's say, appease the new administration and go into hiding because they know that there are sanctions looming. And this is why Erdogan now sends his foreign minister to Brussels. And this is also why there are negotiations starting between Greece and Turkey, obviously. But this is all to postpone this or to get over this first wave of speedy, shall I call him, Speedy Joe, as he is called now, the first initiatives of the Biden administration, which might hit Turkey, and which also can, of course, target Russia in this way or the other. We'll see how the Navalny crisis goes on. But there are two good reasons, I think, why they have good reason to wait. First, it's far from certain that Biden will come out of this crisis as a winner. The challenges of the pandemic in the US, the mountains of debt, they are piling up, and a deeply polarized society. Of course, all these problems are tantamount. So, and then also the nationalists are not gone away. They go maybe in hibernation after the January 6th shock, but they might be back. And the second important point is, we always assume, or it's being assumed and said in the West quite often, that Putin is over time, he's running out of cash. And I would like to dispute that assumption, because I think what Putin has displayed in the past years is a way of surviving somehow, and that he has fought his wars with far less financial and organizational commitment than the US ever has. So he's basically conducting low budget wars, and I assume he can go on. So,
but just before conducting a low budget building spree regarding the palaces.
Yes, and of course, then there are some priorities, as we have obviously seen, when money needs to be spent. But anyway, I think that within this worldview, you know, Putin's planet Putin might be rotating smoothly, even if the world changes maybe to the worse. And this is at least the plan. And now I would come to my concluding point, which is where the plan doesn't entirely work, which is Navalny, and the fact, first of all, that he escaped an attack on his life, plotted by the security services. This was against the plan, and then, of course, it was entirely against the plan that he would return to Russia, and then come out with this movie, with this film. Now, as Navalny is in jail, of course, he is under control to a certain extent, but the problem is now that his supporters are getting out of control, and that they are staging demonstrations in many, many cities. And this is for the first time we have seen many local protests here and there in Russia in the past years. But this is how I would call it. It is Единая Россия Оппозиции. It's the United Russia congregation of the opposition, which is for the first time over 11 time zones what we are seeing there. And this, I think it's very important. In this struggle and arm twist with Navalny, I think Putin is, of course, at advantage. He's in control of the army, of the justice system, security services, of TV, which is still the major source of information by more than 70% of the Russian population, according to the Levada Institute. But the trouble for Putin is that Navalny is not a challenge from the outside, as of course now Patrushev and the FSB and Putin himself have been saying, but it is trouble from the inside. Navalny gets more and more support by younger people who do not follow the TV mainstream anymore, but social media. So there is the window to the outside universe, and this is the link of Planet Putin to the rest of the universe, and this is his problem, the younger generation. And I think we'll see where this will be leading. As I said, I think Putin has all leverages at his disposal, but there is something now he feels that he can't control anymore, and which troubles his vision of Planet Putin very strongly.
Thank you. I didn't want to interrupt you because you had a concept. We need to speed up a little bit now.
I try to be speedy, Mike, with this, but sorry if I have overextended my time.
Manuel Zaracin, in his introduction, said there are these amazing protests in Russia, but we should leave them on their own. We should not see it as an opening. At the same time, there is a calculation from Alexei Navalny and his supporters and his group that there will be pressure from the new US president, from Europe, on him to get out. Maybe this is the only hope that he will not get a real sentence after the suspended one next week. The pressure from Russia's adversaries. At the same time, there are Duma elections coming. and there are elections in Germany. So if I may bring you on the spot, Liana, you wrote about this interaction of elections later this year, about waiting time in Kremlin until Angela Merkel as a chancellor is out and the new chancellor is in, which might present an opening and a new partner for Moscow to deal with on the Europe side. How do you see it?
Thank you, Milan. Just very shortly on the protests, I am very pessimistic that any leverage that Europe or even the US might exert on Russia when it comes to Navalny will be successful, because in the past this was always a very clear line that there will be no change, of course, under international pressure. And that was the same, that was so important for Russia and Belarus, right? That if change happens, it happens on Russian terms and not because of outside pressure. So that's why I'm rather pessimistic when it comes to this one. When it comes to leadership changes, I think we will be in an interesting situation this year, next year, because we have this sort of mixture of leadership changes in Germany and then in France next year. And I think that is really something perhaps not to worry about, but to think about a little bit longer, because those are the two crucial figures. In Germany, at least, it becomes a little bit clearer who could be candidates for chancellor, Laschet, Söder, perhaps Spahn, and although sort of Laschet tried to correct his image as a Putin-Versteher in his recent interviews and tweets that he did, there's always this temptation to, if you haven't done it in the past, to try your own reset with Russia and with Putin, because somehow you are the one who can make it, although so many before you have tried. I mean, just to put it a little bit bluntly, that's what Macron did. He said we need a reset in security policy, which didn't work out. But there was sort of this pride. Everyone needs to try. I think Biden is the first one who doesn't try a reset towards Russia. All the other US administrations have tried it before. So there is this temptation. But I think it's important for any successor in Germany to arrive well prepared, because from the Russian side, there will definitely be some sort of testing once the new person is there, some escalation in Ukraine, some other issues to test what will be the position and the reaction of the new person in Berlin. And the third point, which is important, I think, in these leadership changes, is the Normandy format, because that was such a sort of hard issue of Merkel and of the Chancellery, that the concern really is, if she leaves, will her successor put the same passion into the Normandy format, or will it just become another international crisis mechanism, which is not dealt with anymore at the highest level, but sort of becomes these year-long processes that don't lead into anything. So I think it's important that France steps in during this time when it comes to the Normandy format, and then again next year when France has its own elections, that the new German chancellor will quickly brush up on Russia and Eastern Europe, because all of them have not a lot of experience in the region, a part of economic interests, and quickly find their own position supported by the US, especially when it comes to Ukraine and the Normandy format. But hopefully this will not lead to a vacuum in Europe, but the chances are that it could lead into a vacuum for the next 2 years.
And if I'm not mistaken, just to bring Josep Borrell's visit to this picture, the original plan earlier last year in 2020 was that he will visit Kiev and then Moscow in order to carve a role for a high rep, European Union High Representative in the Normandy format, where EU doesn't have any role for the moment. We'll come back to Ukraine and to Donbass. But Andras, one thing we haven't touched upon is the ongoing pandemics. How does it look in Russia? In what shape Russia is? Is the phone calls that were there between German Chancellor and Vladimir Putin on the vaccines an opening for engagement? Or will Russia need more help or cooperation for production of vaccines from Europe?
Thank you, Milan, for allowing me to bring the bad news. When it comes to the phone call between Chancellor Merkel and Putin, I mean, had I known the exact content of the discussion, probably I wouldn't be allowed to tell it. So let me just start from open source information, just very fresh things. Right now, the number of COVID-related fatalities in Russia, according to the official numbers, has just exceeded 70,000, 71.6, if one is interested. However, there are strong question marks about the methodology of how Russia has been reporting COVID-related losses. And if one follows the details, in the end of last year, Deputy Prime Minister Tatyana Golikova once made a very interesting speech in which she revealed some of these methodological details, resulting in that if we add all those fatalities which are not listed as the ones who specifically died exactly from COVID, then all the COVID-related losses could be like 3 times more. So all in all, the methodology according to which Russia has been reporting the fatalities is far from unbiased, let's put it like this. With this 71.6 official fatality rate, the real COVID-related fatality might be something closer to 200,000, and that's pretty bad.
So
here comes the good news.
These numbers tell us in comparison. Is it as bad as in the US? Or?
Not as bad as in the US. If we take the official number, the 71.6, it would indicate that Russia has been faring pretty well, both in terms of total losses and in terms of loss in ratio to the population. However, if we take the real losses or the supposed real losses, again, methodology doesn't help here, then it would mean that Russia is faring pretty bad. Not as bad as the US, not as bad as Brazil, but probably on place number 3 or number 4. So pretty bad. The good news is about the vaccines. There are 2 good news about the vaccines. First thing, and this is brand new right from today, today a newly released poll from the polling center VCIOM. It's a state-operated polling center. It indicated that the readiness to take the vaccine, whatever vaccine, has risen to 57%. Earlier, this was much lower. So we see that the willingness within the Russian population to actually get vaccinated is growing. That's good news. The not that good news is that if you ask the population about what kind of vaccine, then while the overall rate, the overall trust rate in the vaccination is 57%, if you ask the population, would you like to get the Sputnik V? Then only 40% replies that, okay, Sputnik V is also good. So there is a discrepancy between readiness to take the vaccine in general and readiness to take the Sputnik V in particular. And the second type of good news, or not that bad news, is related to the Sputnik V. I mean, in order to assess Russia's resilience to the coronavirus, one needs to see how many people have been so far over the infection, either by recovering or by dying from it. According to the official data, so far, slightly more than 3.7 million people have been over the infection. 3.7 million out of a population of 145, it means that herd immunity is very, very far away, really far away. So the only solution for reaching immunity in the foreseeable future is vaccination. How are we going with vaccination? Again, a declaration from today. Head of the Gamaleya Center, so the center which has been producing the Sputnik V, head of the Gamaleya Center, Ginzburg, just said today that slightly more than 2 million people have been vaccinated so far. Slightly more than 2 million. There are some question marks about whether this is really 2 million or slightly less. But even if we take this 2 million out of a population, again, 145, it will take a lot of time to reach the necessary 60–70% vaccination rate, enough for a herd immunity. What's the bottleneck? Vaccine production. One more thing, sorry. Yeah. What's the bottleneck? Vaccine production. Because Russia has been short of producing both components of the Sputnik V. Good news number 1, they are start putting into production new vaccine types as well. Good news number 2, they are upgrading Sputnik V production capabilities too. I mean, from the 18th of January, so like a week ago or 10 days ago, they started the mass nationwide vaccination program, meaning not only specific age groups, but basically everybody could get the vaccine if there is enough vaccine. And the Putin-Merkel talk as it could be reconstructed from open source. It's about getting the Sputnik V licensed within the European Union, which would permit the production of Sputnik V vaccines also in vaccine factories outside of Russia, in order to speed up the production of the necessary vaccines and doses. Why is it important? Because the immunization of the Eurasian continent is unimaginable without proper immunization of the Russian population. So this is an ongoing story. Russia is in a desperate need to involve external capabilities for producing the Sputnik V. This is where we are in the moment.
And a quick follow-up, as you are in Budapest, and Hungary is the only EU member state which has authorized, its national authorities has certified Sputnik V. What is the latest there? Is the Hungarian government going to use actually Sputnik?
Yes, authorization took place against the recommendation of some of the experts involved. There are unconfirmed rumors that actually the samples and the serial production of Sputnik V vaccines are not the same. So they submitted something of higher quality for the checkup than what they submit for actual vaccination. It's impossible to confirm this from open sources, but we know that the expert community is divided over the use of Sputnik. Nevertheless, Hungarian government is going to push Sputnik into the mass vaccination project. Right now, there is a contract of importing more than 1 million doses of Sputnik V to Hungary in 3 batches in the upcoming 1.5 months. We will see what's coming out of it, but the agreement has already been signed. That's where we are.
Let's return to this topic in Q&A. Also, what does it mean for EU-Russia relations, whether Hungary will be authorized, will be allowed to do it, or breaching EU law on this. But Mikhail, before we go to Q&A, there are elections in Germany, and Russia is a topic, and Navalny, we had a reminder of it last week. How do you see it? Will this be a hot topic, Russia, in between running parties?
I doubt it. There's of course one bone of contention, which is the discussion about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a discussion which has now gone beyond the closed the expert community, but I don't think it will capture or be really a campaign topic. If we look back in general, and this is more an observation about Germany and the history of the Federal Republic, we had campaigns which were almost always focused on big domestic issues, and the few exceptions were back in the 1950s, when Germany's attachment to the West became an issue. It was in 1972 over Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt. And if you take reunification as a foreign policy issue, which was in part, that was the elections of 1990. But other than that, and I don't think that this is strong enough. I think it's also interesting to see how the Social Democrats have in the past 2 elections, and they might try it again this time, to bring defense policy as a topic. So do we really have to pay 2% of our GDP for defense policy if the US commands so? Or it didn't work in 2017, and it didn't work back in 2013 when also the defense questions were shortly brought up by SPD politicians in the campaign. So I think it would be rather backfiring, bringing this up or wasting time for a politician to speak at length about that. So, but it will be very important, even if it's not important in the campaign, it still plays a role to a certain extent in the popularity of politicians, especially on the local level. And I think this is also why prime ministers like Kretschmer in Saxony, for example, traveled before the COVID-19 crisis, traveled to Moscow, or why Manuela Schwesig now came up with this idea of a foundation for climate, to protect the climate, but essentially to support Nord Stream 2. She brought that up, I think, also for domestic use and to enhance her stature in her own Bundesland.
Thank you. Let's move to question and answer part. We have 45 minutes. For that, please introduce yourself. You can use a raise hand function of Zoom. There are also some questions in the chat, which I will read out. But before I do so, maybe Manuel Sarrazin can come with a brief comment or reflection if he wants to after the panel. And if not, then let's go to the first question in chat, which was from Jakob Wallenstein from Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. He's asking about good relations with the West. Was there ever recently a priority for the Kremlin, and haven't they turned away from this priority at least 8 years ago, so even before annexation of Crimea? And a second question about Putin's speech in Davos, I guess yesterday or two days ago, where this is from Asia Wisniewskaya from the Bureau of Renate Alt, a member of Bundestag. Is it possible that Russia and China would join forces and pressure also on global internet regulation? Or will great firewalls and banning of social networks remain a non-national issue? So maybe these questions, the first one for you, Andras.
Okay, thank you. I already replied a bit briefly to Jakob, but it's better to repeat also in speech. Jakob asked whether the turning away took place already like 6 years ago. And I slightly disagreed along four main arguments. My assumption of this turning away has been that back in 2014-15, when the crisis in Ukraine just started and unfolded, I think Russia seriously thought that they could compartmentalize the crisis in Ukraine, so separate it from relations with the EU, and it took some time for them to realize that this was not the case. Point number two, along which I slightly disagree with Jakob's argument, is that even after 2014, Russia has done a lot to foster good relations with many EU countries. One may remember the Putin-Macron meetings, one may remember many other bilateral meetings of the Russian leadership with certain EU countries. Had they given up good relations with the West from the very beginning on, probably they wouldn't have invested so much energy into still fostering bilateral ties with some EU countries. Third factor, anyways, energy dependence, interdependence is still there. So this is decreasing in the long run due to technological developments and all that, but it's still an argument for having at least some kind of ties between the EU and Russia. And the third and the fourth thing, what I argued in my short comment, is that from Russia's perspective, having good relations with the EU, while relations with the US are anyways predictably to be bad. So fostering good relations with the EU could be a tool to actually generate discontent between the two sides of the Atlantic. So to weaken transatlantic partnership. So from Russia's perspective, trying to maintain good relations with the EU could also be a tool for weakening the coherence of, but it took some time to realize that this is not how it works. So all in all, I'm a bit less my approach is a bit more gradual than the question of Jakob. Thank you.
Liana, do you agree?
Yeah, I think those were very valid points that Andras mentioned. I think sometimes this argument about sort of was there an opportunity for Russia or for the West to get Russia back, or did we lose Russia at some point? I think it's an argument that is often used in the debate, and I think that it to some extent underestimates Russia's own agency in this process, right? This narrative about it was the West that pushed us away, that didn't sort of pick up on our offers. It overestimates the leverage that the West perhaps really had in the end on Russia. and it underestimates Russia's own interest and Russia's own agency in this process. And I think it's important to keep this in mind, and so also to keep in mind that this always also has a domestic direction, regardless of foreign policy. It has domestic reasons why Russia is governed the way it is governed right now, just as a short addition to what Andras said.
Thank you. Do you have something to add on the question about Russia, China, and the global internet?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I honestly think that the battles about regulation, global regulation on internet, on social media really has just begun, because I think what was interesting, and many of you already probably observed this, was Navalny's reaction to the Twitter ban of Donald Trump, which brought a completely different perspective to the debate that we had in the US, which was primarily relief that Trump was banned from Twitter. And I think this is something, sort of this discussion also in Europe and in the US, why, when, and how global companies, internet companies, social media companies should be regulated, and which arguments we use to regulate them will resonate in other parts of the world, especially in authoritarian parts of the world, which will try to make use of these arguments for their own purposes. And while it would be a very conscious decision to put these sort of digital spheres together, we could also just see a more gradual development, that some apps that are popular in China are also popular in Russia, and so on. So that is certainly a development that can happen, but I think it's very important to look at what Europe and the US will do in the next years when it comes to internet regulation, and how authoritarian countries will react to this.
Yeah, very good. This is a topic at which we are also looking in the JP. I would invite other people who are with us, who have expertise, maybe to comment, including our colleague Alena Epifanova, if she feels like that during the debate later. But Mikhail Tuman, your reaction to one or both of these questions?
Yeah, let me. Was it a process, or was it a break at one point between Russia and Europe in the past years? I agree with Andras that this was a process. 2014 was the start of the journey of alienation. What I would highlight is that last year, the significance of Navalny, the Navalny shock for both Germany and Russia, because this is actually where both countries all of a sudden found them in a brawl over a person who is very important in Russia's domestic scene, and as a main challenger to the president in one and other ways. And I think this actually was for Russia, from the point of view of Russia, a total a shock about Germany taking care of Navalny and saving him, and also organizing then sanctions within the European Union, a unified European response to what happened, because they considered this a domestic issue. And I think this was another, the last turning point when Russian officials started, and speakers of the foreign ministry like Maria Zakharova, for example, started in an openly condescending and insulting way to address the German foreign minister, and basically show them, you are not interesting to us anymore. It is basically, when I may mention that, this is also the interesting part of the book, where you can read at length about this Russian disinterest in Europe, and also an interest of Russia to display that openly.
And if I may add a question to it about France, the Navalny case was to a certain extent shock also to France and to French President Emmanuel Macron, who met with Chancellor Merkel the day after the poisoning of Navalny took place. And it was just before Paris wanted to announce bilateral consultations on security with Moscow. Do you expect this bilateral dialogue still to take off, to continue?
I'm not sure. It very much depends on the on the development in Russia now and how concerted and unified the European response will be. And I agree with Liana that our influence, our impact, European impact on that is very limited in Russia, and the decisions of the Russian government how to deal with Navalny's supporters and Navalny himself. But of course, it can lead to a further deterioration of the relations. And then, of course, all that would hang in the balance. Every kind of dialogue and would be again threatened by such a development.
Let me tie this with another question in the chat posed by Nick Riesmeyer. Looking to what might happen after federal elections in Germany after September, might the Kremlin use this European vacuum to test? So there's a background noise. Somebody needs to mute his or her microphone. Thank you. So the question is, might the Kremlin use a European vacuum after the German elections for a new tension, for not engagement and cooperation, but for a new adventure, expansion?
Happy to talk this. I mean, this is always the Crimea scenario, right? That everyone thinks about, you know, you need some domestic distraction and then you have Crimea and the situation of Eastern Ukraine. I think we can even sort of broaden our thinking about how sort of expansion or interference might take place. And what I'm more worried about is a more incremental process, especially in the Eastern neighborhood, because what we've seen last year was definitely that Russia has consolidated its position in the Eastern neighborhood, in Belarus and in the South Caucasus. So the question really is whether Europe in these 2 years of a potential vacuum, not only how it will develop relations with Russia, but also whether it will have the strength and the willingness and the political willingness to shape developments in the Eastern Partnership and in the Eastern neighborhood, and to prevent that the Eastern Partnership becomes only a bureaucratic, incremental process where Ukraine and Georgia have basically exhausted their options, but that it still remains a project of a political willingness to shape the region and not to sort of retreat Europe from this region more and more, especially when it comes to high-level ambitions and how to work on this region, and Russia advances in this region through such incremental processes like the situation in Belarus or the Russia standing in the South Caucasus. So I think the Eastern neighborhood is really an area to look out, not in a Crimea scenario perhaps, but more in an incremental way of potential European retreat and Russian advance.
Thank you. Andras, briefly.
Just very briefly, I mean, the question whether Russia might use the election-related vacuum for some kind of adventuring, the answer, I don't know. But I do know that this question will repeatedly come up during the spring and the early autumn, simply because this is the period when Russia is going to have its Zapad 21 strategic exercise together with Russia and Belarus. So there will be huge rush of military forces moving both within Russia's Western military district and probably also within Belarus. So this will raise a lot of concerns about Russia possibly trying to use the opportunity, just it did like 4 years ago.
The questions are piling up in the chat, but I would also welcome any of our participants to come in and ask the questions through a video. And I have a message, a direct message in the chat from Markus Ederer, the head of EU delegation in Moscow, that he would like to react to what has been discussed. And of course, I will not pass this chance to invite him. If you are with us, Ambassador,
yes,
please take the floor.
Thank you, Milan, and thanks for gathering us around this table. Maybe let me react on a couple of points. I do not think that a multi-vectorial Russian foreign policy is anything new. Well, let us remind ourselves that Russia is a P5 power, which by its definition has a global reach. It has certainly strengthened that. If you look to Africa, if you look to the Middle East, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and certainly is strengthening its ties with China. But I do not see that this is a new phenomenon. And as far as the neighborhood is concerned, where are we? I would possibly side with Jana, because whenever the going gets tough and push comes to shove, from Lukashenko to Pashinyan to Aliyev, everybody calls Moscow, and I have not heard anybody calling Warsaw, Brussels, Berlin, or Paris. In fact, in the Caucasus, the Russians have managed to push the Americans out through the Minsk group, which has been marginalized, and the French for that purpose, and have certainly, with some concessions vis-a-vis Turkey, have kind of reasserted themselves in a certain way. So I would go much more with Mikhail's Planet Putin picture, and I would recommend to you to read two Surkov articles before he left. One is on the sustainable existence of Putinism. I think it was called The Long State of Putin. And the other one is even more interesting. It talks about 100 years of solitude, recognizing that Russia will not and does not need allies, and it does not have allies, and it just has to adjust its policy to that situation. The second point I would like to comment is on Borrell's visit, which is, of course, something we are preparing these days. I heard somebody say it is bad timing. Frankly, I have heard this so very many often times, and believe us seasoned diplomats, there is almost no such thing as good timing for these visits. I would really ask anybody here to give me a better timing. If you only look to 2021, we will see even more of a crackdown on civil society in Russia in the run-up of the elections, and Navalny is only the tip of the iceberg. We see a lot of people going into jail for the wrong reasons. We'll have the Tiergarten murder sentence handed down somewhere in spring, and then we will have the US reaction to everything Biden has now asked to investigate, I think with the core of the SolarWinds hack. So anybody out there who tells me what's a good timing here? I think that that just doesn't exist. A good timing, I mean, for example, Foreign Minister Seato last week missed a good timing because he came here a day after the EU27 published their statement on Navalny. But don't you believe that he said a word about Navalny? I mean, he confessed not having raised it. Okay, so, in my school of diplomacy, talking to each other is not a reward. It's a necessity. It's not about saying, it's about saying the right things, passing the right messages, and you can rely on Borrell passing the right messages. And if anybody believes that he even has a chance to bring him home, just remember Khodorkovsky. It took 10 years to bring him home, right? So the way I see the Russian authorities proceeding, it will be very difficult to get Navalny out of the prison anytime soon. So sorry for this dose of realpolitik, but I think that discussion also needed it. And when it comes to, by the way, vacuums or vacui, I mean, the Russians will always try to fill a vacuum, and then we will be surprised, like in Syria or elsewhere. But I do not see the German elections as a particular starting point. With the new Biden administration, NATO will be stronger, and therefore also the idea of peeling Europe off from the United States, I think, is not a realistic proposition. There was a golden opportunity during the Trump administration, but it did not happen because the transatlantic rift was much deeper. So that's what I have to say on these 3 points. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Ambassador, if I may read out one question to you and to the panelists, what would, if there is a chance for a positive, constructive rapprochement between EU and Russia eventually, how should it look like? What it could look like, and on what issues?
Well, the big question for the EU is whether it can be a transactional, as increasingly other players are transactional. I mean, look at Turkey, Russia. I mean, they're of course bare of any value-based policies, but they even face each other on the battlegrounds from Syria to Libya to the Caucasus, and still they get along at the end of the day. We can do this. I mean, we usually remain on the moral high ground, and then once we have a thing like Navalny, we can't move. But look at the United States. I mean, they do start now, and I'm pretty sure that they will come back in a very tough way later to the Russians. So in the same vein, we can do climate change, and we can do health policies, and we can do some improvement on trade and investment. But can we compartmentalize? Ask the member states. I would not be entirely convinced, but it's certainly something we should try.
Thank you. The question I posed is in the chat from Fyodor Zolotarev, and now Mikhail Tuman, if you can react to Ambassador Ederer.
I think Ambassador Ederer made a very good point in highlighting the difference in approaches and asking whether compartmentalizing is possible, because of course it's many countries conduct relations and have contacts with Russia not laden by any moral considerations. For us, of course, and I think here's a difference, because we have public opinion in Europe. We also have the Council of Europe, of course. We have the EP, we have the European Parliament, so we have lots of voices. And this, of course, makes it more difficult for Europe to have relations with Russia in the same way that Turkey has it, or even the United States. But I think what is important is that to see that not every reaction from Moscow or everything which is going on in Moscow needs a wholesale answer. Not everything needs an answer which entails sanctions and a complete 100% answer, but maybe sometimes less is more, and we will try our European compartmentalization with the US and with Russia. And let me add one thing. Markus Ederer just said rightly that a perfect moment, if Russia wanted to advance its course somehow, it could have done so. It would do so during the Bundestag elections and the transition in Germany, but actually the transition in the US. Why didn't it do so? Because speaking about a vacuum, we had in many aspects, we had a very aggressive, assertive US foreign policy, but on many other aspects, we had a huge vacuum for 4 years. And Putin has taken advantage of this vacuum, 4-year vacuum. And I think he had achieved his goals by then. So I don't see a new vacuum in the time to come for him he's waiting for, but certainly he will use vacuums if the time is ripe and the situation is there. We should be aware of that.
Liana, if I can invite you to react, and tied is also with a question in a chat on the finalization of Nord Stream 2, whether this could be a bargaining chip. There is not only about 70 kilometers of pipelines missing, but also a lot of permits down the road from German authorities.
Yeah, thank you, Milan. Just a short comment on areas of cooperation. I find it interesting that sort of climate policy more and more becomes one of these positive areas where one could cooperate with Russia, which I think is a positive development, but one has nevertheless to be in mind, you know, that Russia is a state that depends on fossil, and that sort of we don't engage in some sort of second modernization partnership hope, just because there might be some areas in climate policy where Russia has changed, perhaps not changed its opinion entirely, but has become more accepting of the fact that climate change is not only advantages for Russia and has not only advantages for Russia in the Far East, but also has a lot of problematic aspects. About Nord Stream 2, I think that's a very interesting question. And I also think it's not only about now the construction of Nord Stream 2. I think even if Nord Stream 2 is constructed, there's still sort of some leverage that you can use with Nord Stream 2. You will certainly not get Navalny out of jail by putting Nord Stream 2 on hold, but I think the important leverage that has already been used is the Ukraine-Russia gas transit. I think that is something where we should definitely continue putting pressure on Russia that after the now bilateral agreement between Ukraine and Russia runs out, we need follow-up, we need security for Ukraine when it comes to gas supplies. And if there's some sort of leverage to use Nord Stream 2, it can obviously only be, it can obviously not be an overt leverage. So Russia would never accept a negotiation where it would look like, because of pressure put on Nord Stream 2, Russia agreed to something. So it has to be a very careful backroom negotiations where one sort of suggests that it might be better in some areas to cooperate to loosen the pressure on Nord Stream 2. But I think the primary link is really here to keep Ukraine safe and to use Nord Stream to keep Ukraine safe, the leverage that you might have.
Andras, your reaction to Ambassador, plus there is a question in the chat from Johannes Kretschmann about frozen conflicts that Moscow can use them, of course, to force Europe to engage. There are plenty of those, and this is your area that you look at closely.
Thank you very much. About Transnistria, I do not know much. However, what I see as something developing quite rapidly or quite dynamically in the eastern neighborhood is right now the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. The bad news is that even though the ceasefire agreement has been signed in mid-November last year, it did not regulate a number of very, very important issues. Number one, the overall status of the yet Armenian-controlled Nagorno-Karabakh. Number two, the exact mandate of the Russian peacekeeping forces. Yep, their presence is in the ceasefire agreement, but what exactly their mandate is, it's not regulated. And unlikely that it would get regulated anytime soon. Withdrawal of Armenian troops, because it's not really taking place from Nagorno-Karabakh. So there I see the opportunity for Russia to actually use its peacekeeping forces to create quite new realities on the ground. The ceasefire agreement prescribes that after 5 years, any of the sides, meaning Azerbaijan, could object the continued presence of Russian peacekeepers in Karabakh. However, comes the question, what if Russian peacekeepers do not leave? What then? What would Azerbaijan go to war against Russian peacekeepers? Since Georgia, since 2008, we know for a fact that any attack on Russian peacekeepers is something that Russia handles as a casus belli. Not to mention the interesting fact that even though according to the ceasefire agreement, the peacekeeping contingent should be smaller than 2,000 personnel, in reality, there are more than 4,000 of them within Nagorno-Karabakh already, and many of them are actually frontline troops. So not just peacekeepers, but really first-line, well-trained professional troops. So even in the medium term, I see quite some instability potentially unfolding in Nagorno-Karabakh. On Transnistria, however, I'm just not in the position to comment professionally. I apologize for that.
We have 15 minutes to go. There are many questions in the chat, and let me invite those who post them to come up and ask through camera, to ask our panelists through camera. I see Gustav Gressel, so I will invite those who I see on camera to ask your questions. So Gustav, we may start with you, and please be brief.
Well, about timing, you hear my kids in the background, which No, I basically coming back to the previous discussion and why Russia constantly misreads it. If you try to put yourself into Moscow's shoes and try to read the communication that they have with us, I would not be much surprised that they constantly misread us. Think of 2014, what kind of dialogue forums they had in Germany with Germany. Of course, they were surprised that Germany does not accept the Crimean Anschluss. They basically, dialogue with Russia had been in the hand of those who, for their own political agenda, wished a close and amicable relations. And if you see current business for us, the problem is that that continues. And here we still, after 6 years after 2014, have insufficiently managed to reshape our dialogue structures, especially in Germany, to really convey hard messages, except for the Madame Chancellor. But that might create the hope in Moscow that if Madame Chancellor is gone, that you might return to the Germany that was there before.
Thank you. I will collect more questions now. If Anna-Karina, if Anna-Karina Hamker, if I read it well, is with us, please take the mic.
Yes, I'm here. Hello. Thank you for the opportunity. I just wanted to follow up on the China-Russia relations, and I was wondering how Russia actually sees the rise of China and how it might like to shape the rise of China in terms of its interests.
And I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself. Gustav Gressel is from European Council on Foreign Relations, and if you can also tell us your affiliation.
Yes, I'm studying international security at Sciences Po in Paris.
Thank you. And the next in the row is Boris Ginsburg.
Hello. Hello. My name is Boris Ginsburg. I'm a doctoral researcher at the FU Berlin. A question to all panelists. In December 2020, the Duma
Boris, we can hardly hear you. Please speak up.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes, it's much better.
In December 2020, the Duma passed a law which would extend the judicial protection of former presidents, which means that theoretically the option of an exit of Putin is still on the table in the Kremlin. So my question is, has the EU or Germany maybe any strategies for such a scenario? Because today's discussion is based on the assumption that Putin will stay in office in the next years. So maybe you have some thoughts about this question. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Flavio Lira, if he's still with us, the floor is yours.
I am sorry, my camera is not working, but thank you for the opportunity. So it's a very quick question about Russia's worries about its foreign policy elsewhere outside Eurasia. So how do the speakers see Russia's engagement with far-right administrations, such as Brazil, for example, now that Biden has taken over and Trump is not a big supporter of far-right administrations elsewhere? Can Putin maybe fill in that void or strengthen its relations with those administrations? Thank you.
Thank you. And Flavio Lira is an international relations professor and researcher on Eurasian security. I missed your institution. Last in the queue is Mario Baumann. If you are with us, please ask your question.
Hi, I'm a PhD researcher for the University of Kent. My question is also on Russia-China relations. There is this rhetoric of a turn to China in Russia. It's almost like a vision. And it's probably more motivated by a turn away from the West than a genuine turn to China. And my question would be whether this is basically supported by both sides. I'm not much of an expert on China, but what role does Russia play for China? Is that a genuine option, or is this just kind of an empty rhetoric in Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. And now to our panelist. Andras Rats was noted during the last question, so why don't you start?
Thank you. To Mario Baumann's question, I highly recommend actually reading the China chapters of the paper. I mean, both authors are really knowledgeable. The texts are short, concise, and very much to the point. Going concretely to your question about what is China's interest in having better relations with Russia, first, there is, of course, the energy and economy. This is something we can easily guess. This is known fact. And China is also learning a lot from Russia's military experience, particularly in Syria. One shall not forget, Chinese troops, regardless of how developed they are technologically, they lack battlefield experience. They haven't fought for a long, long time. So China is actually very much interested in gaining Russia's experience about actual combat, how to fight in the 21st century war. Another part, China is eager to learn from Russia some elements of military technology. It was in news from last year that Beijing and Moscow agreed on a joint setup, actually Russia helping China to set up an early warning system against ballistic missiles. This is a field of military technology in which China is still a bit backwards vis-a-vis Russia. So this missile technology or early warning technology cooperation is also a part. Third element is China is also cooperating with Russia on the artificial intelligence-based technologies, face recognition, and things like this. So in the security sector, there are also a lot of details of cooperation, which is interesting not only for China, not only for Russia, but also for China as well. Read particularly Svanström within the paper. He's truly an expert on security cooperation. And if you're interested in the Russian side, Vasily Kashin is the one to read.
Yeah, Anna, can you take other questions?
Yeah, happy to do so. Gustav's question, also the question, are there strategies for post-Putin era? I think you're right, Gustav, that, you know, sort of the context, the German-Russian context before 2014 was certainly very special, but I think it's puts almost too much blame on ourselves to say it's our own fault that Russia misestimated our responses, because even before the annexation of Crimea, there was this ongoing debate in Germany, especially pushed by the Greens to take on a more critical stance towards Russia. And I think that's something, honestly, that Russia could not have missed if they have an embassy in Berlin. So they must have observed this debate, and they must have known that the mood is changing and that the modernization partnership times are over. And then also, of course, there's the business community, but at latest since 2014, I think it became clear to Moscow that the business community can get trumped by political interests and must subordinate itself to political interests in some situations. And then last but not least, we also had a lot of great ambassadors in Moscow in the last years who also, I think, conveyed a very clear picture of German policies. So I would not go too far to say it's really our own fault. I think it's a fault of perhaps Moscow seeing only what it wants to see in Germany and in German statements. Then about the post-Putin era, it's a difficult question. I think there are a lot of scenario exercises going on what happens after Putin, what could be potential scenario. And this has always been the case for many years. I think what is always interesting in these scenarios that the biggest fear at least that was my perception, the biggest fear in Germany is always chaos in Russia. And that there was a wish for some sort of orderly transition if this happens, but this scenario of some chaos worse than in the 1990s takes hold in Russia, darker forces, then Putin can take over. I think that is something many policymakers and observers are scared of, and probably with good reason. And then to the Kremlin's links to the far right, we had this example in Germany in December when two AfD politicians traveled to Moscow and were greeted by Lavrov. Again, that's quite a high level welcome from the Russian side. I think that's a game that Russia is going to continue to play. I think it depends on whether it steps up this game, whether this sort of it goes beyond what is happening right now towards explicit financing, for instance, towards a situation like in the US, 2016 in German parliamentary elections, so a very clear Russian interference. I think that would be interesting. They will always play this game, but it's interesting to observe whether they will feel the need to step this up, at least in the German context.
And Mikhail, with you, if I can tie up one more question that I see now in the chat about the protests in Russia. Not only young people, but also mid-generation. There were some some research about protesters in Moscow. 40% new people who from a different strata of society that never came up for protest are there. So something is happening both in Russian society, and we haven't touched that, but also within the Moscow establishment. Rumors about the changes at the top of the key companies. A lot of sort of rumors and information about Putin's personal life in Russian media, not only leaked to Navalny, but leaked to the media. So a lot of instability coming up. What does it mean for Russian policy, for President Putin? You have observed him for a long time. He's been in power. He's been in Kremlin for what, 21 years? There will be post-Putin Russia eventually. Do you think he might be preparing to step aside?
Well, I don't think Putin is preparing to step aside, but he's done everything to stay in power as long as possible, or as we've seen from the constitutional changes to 2036. I think this was not accidentally that he did this, but undoubtedly, and as we've said on the panel, it is, I think, and in the discussion, it is clear that these demonstrations bring up an entirely new challenge. And the fact that Putin is now trying, it was very interesting to see him reacting to the film, to the movie, the documentary of Navalny, when he answered that, yes, I haven't seen the film, but I can tell you that everything in the film is wrong. You know, and it was actually a very weak defense. And many people are having doubts today in Russia about the lifestyle and, of course, the official salaries of their government officials. So what I think is important, or the challenge for Putin now, is that this man was able to reinvent himself several times. And in the early 2000s, he was stabilizing Russia, and then he brought money to Russia due to the high oil prices. And then he reinvented himself after the Bolotnaya protests as a nationalist, and he fought the wars, and he took Crimea. But this whole nationalist narrative now is also coming to an end, because Crimea, Ukraine, Syria, all the successes on the world stage, that doesn't fascinate the people anymore. So, and the question for him is now, what's my new narrative? And I think he hasn't found one yet, and this is his problem. One last remark on possible misreadings of Germany and Moscow. I fully agree with Gustav and Liana on that. And I think this misreading is, it's not only that they might hope for Armin Laschet or Markus Söder being somehow easy to handle or more understanding, or German realists, whatever, but it is that they overlook the aspect that the Green Party is the most possible coalition partner of the Christian Democrats. I see that the Russian embassy here in Germany, they have lots of contacts in German civil society, but it's people, audiences attached to Die Linke or to AfD maybe, and they do not tap into these resources of voters of the Green Party. And I think this is a big mistake. They should get much more interested in what's going on there and how they think, because that might be where the most resistance comes from in the future as of September 2021.
And this is a perfect moment for Manuel Saracen to close, to come with closing remarks. Our time is running up. If you can wrap it up in 1 minute, please.
Yeah, so I have to disappoint Mikhail Tuman to a certain extent on this, because you know, I remember the Gay Pride, the Christopher Street Day parade in Hamburg in 2005. And you know, the partner city town twinning is Hamburg, St. Petersburg since the 50s already, in 1959. So by incident, the green car, the green truck, where you're going to party and you're drinking too much, and was just in front of the group of organized gay and lesbian people from Russia who had the placards in 2005 with Putin. And for every green on the truck, those ones were the biggest heroes because they already know what is happening to this minority in Russia. So this old thing of the Greens being especially linked to minorities is immunizing our party to a certain extent against such authoritarian regimes. And I think that those people, like, for example, the gay movement, earlier recognized what kind of regime Russia is heading to than we did, we foreign policy experts. They knew already in 2005 what guy Putin is. We recognized in 2008 or 2014, perhaps. And I don't think that anybody, I don't think that the Russian embassy has any way of influencing this areas too much, because this is too much old-fashioned. They were influencing the Greens better in the beginning of the Greens, perhaps, when the Greens were founding. But I think they need a new toolbox. Perhaps it will not so easy to make it. For closing remark, just one thing, which I think is really interesting. Adding to the reaction Mikhail Tuman explained, Putin gave on this Navalny video. He didn't say that he's not using this compound, this dvorets. Yeah? He just said it's not his. But I mean, this whole video is exactly explaining that it's not his. So actually, it is clear Putin cannot confess openly that he's not a rich man, because then he would be a soft egg. You understand? And this is so magic. He couldn't confess that they didn't try to, that they don't kill people like Navalny. He just said if we wanted to kill him, he would be dead. And I think this is also interesting. Yeah, everybody in Russia knows what is the truth there. So how could Putin stay credible by honestly saying, I'm not a corrupt rich guy killing people who attack me? Yeah, and this is a new Putin. Yeah, Putin was a kind of, in former times, everybody in Russia hated politics, but Putin was the only good guy. And I think this has changed. And this reaction on this students' questionnaire, I think this was this was interesting for me. Yeah.
With this, we have to leave it there. I'm afraid. Thank you very much to Manuel Zaracin, Liana Fix, Andras Rac, and Mikhail Tuman for your time. Thank you to all participants, to my colleagues, organizers. We will be back with Strategy Group Russia in the same format. Our focal point for 2021 will be Russia's role in regional conflicts, post-Soviet and other non-Soviet, and comparison, what toolbox is Russia using. And also next week, right the morning after Navalny's trial, we will have early bird breakfast. Please write us if you have not received the invitation. Thank you, have a good afternoon, and please read the publication. All the best.
Thank you, goodbye.